I never thought a driveway gate something meant to keep life orderly. Private and calm would become the battleground for the most exhausting, infuriating conflict of my adult life. But that's the thing about power in the wrong hands. It doesn't need a battlefield. It just needs a rule book and someone arrogant enough to weaponize it. And in my neighborhood, that person was her. The HOA board's favorite enforcer. The woman everyone whispered about at mailbox clusters and block parties. The one who smiled like she was doing you a favor while tightening the screws behind your back. The kind of person who didn't just enjoy control but needed it like oxygen. And it all started so small it almost feels ridiculous now. With a sleek electric SUV repeatedly parked right in front of my private gate, blocking access to my own property as if my land was an extension of her convenience, as if my schedule, my work, my life simply didn't matter. And the first time it happened, I gave her the benefit of the doubt because decent people assume decency in others. I figured maybe it was a mistake. Maybe she didn't realize that the gate led to a working property where trucks came and went daily. Maybe she didn't see the signage. Maybe she was just distracted, so I waited. And when she finally strolled back hours later, tapping on her phone like the world was on pause until she finished scrolling, I politely asked if she could avoid parking there in the future because it blocked access. And she smiled, tight, thin. Patronizing, said she was just running errands, and that the HOA rules allowed temporary parking near common access points, which was the first red flag because my gate wasn't a common access point. It was a private one, clearly marked, legally surveyed, and approved long before the HOA ever existed. But she said it with such confidence that for a moment I almost doubted myself, almost, until the next week when it happened again. And then again, always during hours when she knew I had deliveries scheduled. Always positioned perfectly to block the swing of the gate. Always just close enough that maneuvering around it would mean scraping paint, or worse. And every time I brought it up, she escalated. Suddenly, it wasn't just a neighborly issue. It was an HOA concern. She started citing obscure clauses, threatening fines, sending emails dripping with faux professionalism, CCing board members who didn't know the property and didn't care to learn. And what made it worse was the tone, that smugged certainty that came from knowing she had a badge without. Earning it power without responsibility, authority without accountability. I tried to resolve it the right way. I really did. I attended meetings. I brought documents, surveys, photos, timestamps. I spoke calmly while she rolled her eyes, interrupted, reframed my objections as aggressive behavior, and suggested I was being unreasonable for objecting to temporary inconvenience. As if blocking someone's only access point wasn't a serious issue. As if I didn't rely on that gate for my livelihood. Because my property wasn't just a home, it was operational land. A place where equipment moved, where schedules mattered, where delays cost real money. And she knew that. She absolutely knew that. Which is why she kept doing it, because for people like her, inconvenience isn't a side effect, it's the point. And the HOA backed her. Not because she was right, but because she was loud, persistent, and exhausting, the kind of person who makes it easier to side with her than to challenge her. And over time, the situation eroded something in me. Not all at once, but slowly, in the way water wears down stone. Every blocked delivery, every condescending email, every fine threatened but never justified, every neighbor who shrugged and said, "You know how she is." As if that explained anything, as if it excused it, and the final straw came on a morning when a logging truck, one of several scheduled. That week was delayed because her vehicle sat there again, silent, smug, gleaming in the sun like it owned the place. And I stood at my gate, phone in hand, staring at the obstruction, feeling something shift from frustration to clarity. Because in that moment, it became obvious that this wasn't going to end with polite requests or HOA appeals. It was going to end when reality finally collided with entitlement. When consequences showed up uninvited, and as the truck idled behind me, heavy, massive, loaded with timber, destined for processing, I realized something else too, something unsettling and oddly calm. That systems only work when everyone respects them, and when someone abuses the system to dominate others. The system stops being a shield and starts being a weapon. And I was done being on the wrong end of it, done pretending that reason alone could fix someone who thrived on conflict. And as I looked at that blocked gate, at that vehicle parked where it didn't belong, I knew this story was no longer about parking. or rules, or even the HOA. It was about what happens when arrogance meets immovable reality, and whether power built on intimidation can survive its first real test. By the time the situation reached its boiling point, the neighborhood had already been conditioned to treat conflict like background noise, like the hum of power lines you stop noticing after a while, and that conditioning was exactly what let her thrive. Because silence is fertilizer for people who mistake authority for superiority. And in the days following that last block delivery, the emails intensified, the HOA notices multiplied, and the whispers grew louder, as if the narrative had already been written, and I was cast as the unreasonable problem resident who refused to cooperate. And she leaned into that role for me with theatrical enthusiasm, forwarding edited screenshots quoting selective clauses, framing every objection I raised as hostility, every defense as defiance, every attempt at compromise as manipulation, and the board, a rotating cast of retirees and passive busybodies, nodded along, because she spoke with confidence, and confidence often masquerades as competence. And I watched in disbelief as logic lost ground to volume, as facts were drowned out by tone, and as the very structure meant to ensure fairness turned into a megaphone for someone who enjoyed punishing people she didn't. T-like, and the thing that hurt more than the inconvenience, more than the financial losses, it's more than the absurdity of being fined for defending access to my own property, was the realization that most of my neighbors saw it, understood it, and still chose comfort over courage, preferring not to get involved because involvement meant becoming a target, and targets were what she collected like trophies. But what none of them saw was the quiet escalation happening behind the scenes, the way deliveries were stacking up, contracts were tightening, deadlines were shrinking, and every obstruction compounded into real pressure, real consequences, and real risk. And on the morning everything changed. The air felt different, heavier. Like the kind of stillness that comes before weather turns violent, the logging truck arrived early, larger than usual, its trailer stacked with long timber secured by steel braces, the engine rumbling low and steady like something ancient and patient. And as it turned into the drive, there it was again. Her vehicle parked precisely where it would cause the maximum disruption. Not slightly off, not accidentally misaligned, but surgically placed, like a statement, like a dare, and I stood there staring at it, feeling a strange calm settle over me, not rage, not panic, but the cold clarity that comes when you finally accept that the rules of the game have changed, and the driver stepped out, shaking his head, muttering about schedules and delays. And I made the call I'd been avoiding, not to the HOA, not to the board, not to the woman who had turned governance into a personal hobby, but to reality itself. Because reality doesn't respond to emails. It responds to physics, weight, momentum, and inevitability. And in that moment, everything converged. The months of condescension, the blocked access, the manufactured fines, the twisted narratives, the silent neighbors, the smug smiles, the casual abuse of power. And the truck idled forward as we attempted a tight maneuver. Slow, cautious, measured, but space was space, and obstruction was obstruction. And there was a sound, a deep, ugly sound, metal compressing against metal, the kind that doesn't scream, but groans. And then silence, followed by shouting, running, hands flying to mouths, phones appearing out of nowhere, and suddenly the neighborhood that had ignored every prior incident had gathered like spectators at a spectacle. And there it was, her pristine symbol of status now folded and broken, at the front debris scattered across the drive, timber looming behind it like an indifferent witness, and she arrived moments later, breathless, furious, face contorted. Between disbelief and outrage, screaming about lawsuits, negligence, recklessness, abuse, as if the months preceding that instant had never existed, as if cause and effect were optional, as if her actions had no. Lineage and the officer arrived calm, methodical, asking questions, documenting, listening, and for the first time. The story wasn't being told through forwarded emails or curated screenshots, it was being told through measurements. Angles, obstruction lines, access rights, recorded complaints, timestamps, and a paper trail that suddenly mattered, and while she paced, gestured, demanded, threatened, I stood there quietly, not triumphant, not celebrating, but grounded in the strange stillness that comes when something long overdue finally happens, when inevitability arrives. When a system built on intimidation collides with something it can't intimidate. And I realized as neighbors whispered and phones recorded, and the sun hung indifferent overhead, that this wasn't the climax. It was the pivot. Because power rarely disappears when confronted. It adapts, it retaliates, it reshapes itself into something more desperate, more vindictive and more dangerous. And I could already see it in her eyes. The recalculation, the shift from smug certainty to wounded pride, the silent promise that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. And as the truck backed away and the officer finished notes, and the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving tire marks, debris, and stunned silence behind, I knew that the real battle hadn't been the collision. It had been everything that led up to it, and everything that would come after, because people who build their identity on control don't surrender when exposed. They escalate, and the neighborhood was about to learn that the sound of crushing metal was only the opening note of something much louder. If I thought the collision would bring clarity or closure, I was wrong, because clarity threatens people who survive on confusion. And closure terrifies those who mistake conflict for relevance. And in the days that followed, she transformed from an HOA enforcer into something far more volatile. A self-appointed crusader fueled by humiliation, and the retaliation began almost immediately, not loud at first, not obvious, but methodical, strategic, designed to overwhelm rather than confront. Because confrontation risks exposure, while paperwork can bury truth under sheer volume. And suddenly, I was receiving notices for violations that had never existed before. Absurd citations about fence height measured incorrectly. Landscaping complaints filed anonymously, but written in her unmistakable tone. Accusations of unsafe commercial activity on property that had been legally designated for operational use for decades, and every letter carried the same implication. That the incident at the gate wasn't an accident. It was evidence of recklessness, of hostility, of someone unfit to coexist in a harmonious community, and she sold that narrative hard. Holding emergency HOA meetings, speaking tearfully about fear, about threatening behavior, about how she had been targeted, and watching neighbors nod along. It was like watching people accept a lie, not because it made sense, but because it was easier than asking questions. And yet, despite the noise, something had changed. Because this time, there was a record, not just of the collision, but of everything leading up to it. The blocked access complaints logged with local authorities, the delivery delays documented by vendors, the emails where she dismissed concerns, the HOA meeting minutes where my objections were minimized or reframed, and the officersreport.com/neutral, devastating in its simplicity. Noting the obstruction, the lack of clearance, the repeated complaints, and the unavoidable physics of the situation. And as the legal letters started arriving, thick envelopes filled with threats dressed as formal language. Something unexpected happened. The tone shifted, because bluster doesn't work when facts enter the room, and her attorney's language softened, hedged, asked questions instead of making demands, and for the first time, I could sense uncertainty creeping in where arrogance used to live. But that didn't stop her from doubling down publicly, from cornering neighbors, from spinning versions of the story where she was the victim of negligence, of aggression, of bullying by heavy machinery, and the absurdity of that phrase would have been funny if it hadn't been so telling, because it revealed how disconnected she was from cause and effect, from responsibility, from the idea that her choices had weight. And the HOA board began to fracture under the pressure, because some members started asking questions they should have asked months earlier, about access rights, about liability, about whether they had exposed the association to legal risk by ignoring documented complaints. And suddenly the meetings weren't friendly echo chambers anymore. They were tense, quiet, filled with uncomfortable pauses. And she reacted the only way she knew how, by trying to assert more control, cutting people off, dismissing concerns, accusing dissenters of disloyalty. And that's when the spell began to break, because authority that demands loyalty instead of earning trust is brittle. And once it cracks, everyone hears it, and neighbors who had stayed silent started approaching me privately, sharing stories, similar patterns of harassment, selective enforcement, intimidation through fines and threats, a trail of small abuses that hadn't seemed significant on their own, but formed a clear picture when viewed together. And I realized this wasn't just about my gate or my property or that single collision. It was about a system that had allowed one person to turn communal governance into a personal weapon. And as complaints accumulated and legal counsel advised caution, the HOA's posture shifted from aggressive to defensive, because now the risk wasn't me, it was her. It was the paper trail, the pattern, the exposure. And watching her try to regain control was like watching someone grab at smoke, every move making the situation worse. Every outburst confirming what had previously been whispered, and the more she pushed, the more visible the cracks became, until the neighborhood that had once avoided conflict was forced to confront it. Because the cost of silence had finally exceeded the discomfort of speaking up and standing there one evening. Looking at the repaired gate, the cleared drive, the quiet that had returned, not through submission but through scrutiny, I understood something fundamental about power, that it doesn't collapse when challenged. Emotionally, it collapses when documented, when illuminated, when stripped of ambiguity. And while she still glared at me from across meetings, still muttered about injustice, still clung to the belief that authority meant immunity. The truth was already moving slow, but unstoppable, through committees, through reviews, through legal advisories. And this time, she wasn't directing it, she was trapped inside it. And the realization settled in with a strange mix of relief and gravity that the collision hadn't ended the conflict, it had exposed it, and exposure is the one thing control can't survive. The end didn't arrive with fireworks, or shouting, or some dramatic moment of public humiliation, the way people imagine justice does. Because real accountability is quieter than revenge, and far heavier. And it settled over the neighborhood like a slow, undeniable weather change, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore as reviews were initiated. Policies scrutinized, legal advice circulated in careful language. And the HOA board, once so eager to defer to her confidence, began distancing itself from the very authority it had handed her so casually. And she felt it. You could see it in the way her emails grew shorter, less certain, more defensive, in the way her speeches at meetings lost their rhythm. No longer met with nods, but with silence, questions, and the occasional uncomfortable pause. And when the findings finally surfaced, they weren't dramatic accusations. Just facts laid out plainly. Patterns identified without emotion, selective enforcement noted, documented complaints ignored, liability risks acknowledged, and that was enough, because power that survives on intimidation can't survive daylight, and one by one, the structures that had protected her began to withdraw. Legal counsel advising restraint, the board quietly reassigning responsibilities, committees formed without her involvement until the role she had, wielded like a weapon, was reduced to something ceremonial, hollow, stripped of its reach, and the neighborhood noticed. Because silence had been replaced by something else, a cautious honesty. People talking openly now about past experiences, about fines that made no sense, about warnings delivered with smiles and threats underneath. And the narrative she had controlled for so long dissolved not in outrage but in consensus. And when she finally resigned, framed as a personal decision for the sake of harmony, it felt less like a victory and more like an exhale. A release of tension that had been normalized for far too long, and life didn't become perfect afterward. It became functional, which is far more valuable. Deliveries arrived on time, access stayed clear, rules were applied consistently, instead of selectively. And the HOA returned to what it was always supposed to be, boring, procedural, forgettable, and standing at my gate months later, watching another truck roll through without obstruction, without incident, I thought about how easily this could have gone differently if I had accepted the inconvenience, paid the fines, kept my head down, because that's how abuse survives, not through force, but through exhaustion, through people deciding it's easier to endure small injustices than to confront them. And I realized the most dangerous thing about unchecked authority isn't the damage it causes immediately. It's the damage it normalizes over time, the way it teaches people to accept what they shouldn't, to doubt what they know is right, and to mistake compliance for peace. And I didn't crush a car to make a point. I didn't stand my ground out of spite. I stood it because access to your own life, your own work, your own property, isn't a privilege granted by someone louder than you. It's a right protected by clarity, documentation, and the willingness to stop negotiating with entitlement. And if there's a lesson buried in all of this, it's not about vehicles or gates or associations. It's about understanding that power without accountability always overreaches. And when it does, it doesn't collapse because someone fights back angrily. It collapses because someone refuses to move out of the way, refuses to let reality be rewritten, and lets consequences speak in the only language they understand.